The doctor, one of the newer plastic surgeons at Kashmir Hospital, looked a little sheepish as he approached my desk. I had only seen him a few times, and he had never spoken to me directly. He was a vain fella, in the same vein as a few of the other hotshot docs around the ER. But today, he looked rattled. His hair was unkempt, his clothes looked dirty, and he was glancing around in that way that made me think he might be followed. "Are you the one who collects the stories?" he asked. I looked around, not sure if he was hiding from someone, before telling him that I was. "Carl said you'd understand. I don't know what happened to me, but he told me that you might be able to help me make sense of it. I know you're at work, but do you have a minute to talk?" It was currently about 10 o'clock, and I was in the middle of a lull in activity. The real work wouldn't be possible until they called for visitors to leave, so I pushed out a chair and pulled out a notepad. I'd started carrying it religiously, the stories becoming habitual, and I wanted to get all the information while it was fresh. His name was Dr. Gary Long, and he'd experienced something that I had only heard about once before. The more he talked, the more I realized that he was talking about the creatures that had taken up residence in the forbidden corridor over the East Wing record mezzanine. I've only been working at Kashmir for a couple of months, but I'd heard all the rumors. Dr. Logan still tells people about what happened to him in the elevator. People talk about the ghost girl in the South Wing that jumps from the 5th-story balcony. And everyone, nurses and doctors alike, know that if you're in the OR too late, you might run into Shaky Leg Mary. I listened, but privately I thought they were nothing but stories. It was just talk. Every hospital has them, but Kashmir Hospital has a bit of a reputation. Even in med school, the students knew about the weirdness that surrounded the hospital, and when my friends heard I'd accepted a job offer there, they joked that I was going to get taken away by a ghost one night. Well, I don't think it was a ghost that tried to get me. Ghosts don't do what this thing did. It was late when I got done with my case. I dressed out and was leaving to get my car from the garage. This sounds silly, but I always park my car at the bottom of the parking lot. It's a 2021 Mercedes that I'm still likely going to be paying for when I'm 40, but doctors are expected to maintain a certain air of affluence. Fancy watches, big houses, shiny cars, it all gives off the illusion of wealth, while most of us are drowning in student loans or credit card debts. The car was a frivolity that I couldn't really afford, but I was trying and mostly succeeding at keeping my head above water. So when I took the elevator down to the 5th-floor basement of the car park and found nothing but empty spots, I was shocked. I had parked it in the 3rd spot on the left side, and now it was gone. There were no other cars down there either, so I could only assume that someone had either stolen it or it had been towed for some reason. I was grumbling when I climbed back into the elevator, but I felt confident that this could be solved in short order. If it had been stolen, then my insurance would get me a rental car and the police would find it. The car was insured for quite a lot, and I had little doubt that the premiums would buy me another one if it had been taken. If the hospital had my car towed, then they would get me a rental car and get the impound lot to bring my damn car back. When the elevator didn't move after I jabbed the buttons, my anger flared. I slapped at the buttons, but nothing happened. I picked up the phone and tried to call the switchboard, but there was no tone. The door didn't close either, which didn't seem weird until I thought about it. They just stayed open, and finally I threw the phone at the bank of lit-up buttons and decided to walk out of the garage and find someone to yell at. It had been a long day, and I was tired, and all this bullcrap was really starting to make me mad. I started walking towards the ramp then, and if I'd known what would happen later, I think I'd have just stayed in the elevator. The next floor up was empty too, and I wondered how late it was before my watch told me it was barely 9. Most of the other employees were probably just lazy and didn't want to drive all the way back up. They didn't care if people dinged their cars, and I figured I would see more cars as I went up. It was comfortable enough down here, the concrete box creating a cave of sorts, and the fluorescents overhead hummed with insectile good cheer. Other than the hum, my footfalls seemed to be the only noise. The constant tock, tock, tock of my sneakers was monotonous, but it was also a little nice to know that I hadn't just gone deaf. There really wasn't any other sound down there, and as I came to the third floor, I was surprised that there still wasn't any windows to the outside. The first 2 levels had been basements, but surely this one should be at ground level, right? This floor was when I started to notice the plants as well. They were palmettos, I think, and they sprouted up from the concrete in places. The fronds looked pokey, and I really didn't want to touch them and find out. I wondered why maintenance or groundskeeping hadn't done something about them, but it was really none of my business. They were in the corners and out of the way, and they weren't hurting anything. The Georgia flora has always been a bit invasive sometimes, and seeing plants in a man-made structure wasn't anything uncommon. That was the first time I felt something watching me, too. I was coming up the ramp and onto the second floor when I heard something scrub against the concrete. It was a low sound, like fingernails, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The concrete parking structure was still empty, and it was becoming odd that I hadn't seen any cars or people. A dozen others, nurses and techs, had been with me in the surgery, and to see neither them or their vehicles here was strange. I was coming to the level just beneath the entrance ramp. Why hadn't I seen anyone yet? As the phantom eyes bored twin holes into my shoulder blades, I picked up the pace. I wanted to be out of here. My anger was beginning to subside as the creeping chill of fear sent icy fingers through it. The next floor should have definitely been at ground level, but it was the same bland box that the others had been. There were no cars, no people, but the plants had gotten thicker. They were looking more like jungle plants now, and the cool cave was becoming a little humid. I saw vines hanging from the ceiling, and they seemed to be coming right out of the concrete. Why hadn't I ever noticed any of this before? Its presence did little to soothe me, and when I heard a crunch from behind me, I quickened my pace. I could still hear that low noise coming from behind me. I wasn't as alone as I thought. It felt like something was stalking me, and as I ran up the next ramp, I almost cried out when it was more of the same. I was running now, my feet carrying me onward as my brain began to scream that we were trapped. The plants were becoming more dense, growing up out of the floor, and the concrete seemed to be giving way to dirt in places. I was running now, my feet carrying me onward as my brain began to scream at me that we were trapped. I stumbled, but I caught myself before I fell and glanced back to make sure that nothing was chasing me. I don't know how, but I knew that if I fell, that would be the end of me. I'd gone higher than the parking deck could possibly be, 5 floors higher than the roof, when the lights suddenly went out. I don't mean that the lights flickered. I don't mean they just sort of dimmed. I mean that suddenly I was something akin to blind. As I stood still in the blackness, I could hear them again. They sounded like animals, walking around on all fours as their claws scraped across the ground. I had thought there was only one of them, but the longer I listened, the more I thought it might be 2 or 3 or as many as 6. They were searching for me, stalking me through the murk, and I didn't dare move. Something in the instinctual part of my brain told me that if I moved, they'd know where I was. It told me to stand as still as I could and not to make a sound as they hunted for me. They searched, I sniffed, but eventually I heard them moving away, and that was when I made my escape. I ran like my life depended on it, and maybe it did. They heard me sooner than I would have thought, and tore off in my general direction. The layout of the parking structure was pretty uniform, and I knew that if I just kept moving in a circle, I could get to the next floor. Something in me screamed that if I could get out of here, that if I could get free of whatever loop I was in, that I could lose the creatures and be done with this madness. Their claws sounded huge as they ate up the ground. They made little huffing noises as they ran, and I couldn't imagine what they might look like. I think I settled on a pack of panthers that had come to get me, and when I suddenly ran into a concrete wall, I just knew they were about to rip me to shreds. It turned out to be for the best, however. As I lay there trying to see if my nose was broken, something hit the wall I had run into with a sound that was loud and angry. It hit it hard enough to send concrete chips cascading over me, and I put a hand over my mouth as I lay completely silent on the dusty concrete. It picked itself up and shook off whatever damage the wall had done to it before snuffling the air soupily. It was looking for me, and I did not want to be found. I could feel its bulk as it came close, smell the rancid meat that must lay beneath those claws, and I hoped that it couldn't hear me trembling. I expected that every breath would be my last, and the thought that I would die as I took shallow half-breaths was depressing. Some indeterminate amount of time later, the creature moved away, and I got up as quietly as I could and tiptoed for the wall. I'd misjudged the circle I was making, and when I found the edge, I headed up the ramp and kept climbing. Something was different now. I could feel it, and when my light-deprived eyes began to adjust to the intrusion of light, I knew I was getting close to the surface. As my hopes came back, I started running again, and that's when I heard them behind me. I came up and saw the crossbar, a little booth that told me the front of the parking deck was in sight. I put on a burst of speed, and when I ducked under the arm, I heard something's claws rake across the wood. I fell onto the asphalt and looked back in time to see a solid black creature with a head like a spade. Its body looked like it was covered in scales instead of fur, and the teeth that hung from that mouth looked painfully big. It had no eyes, but it pointed its spade-shaped head in my direction and seemed to know where I was. Despite the small burn of the moon and the distant islands of the security lights, the creature was still unwilling to come out to get me. It slunk back into the parking structure, and I sighed in relief. I screamed in surprise when I heard footsteps coming towards me, but it was just Carl. He'd been smoking by the parking deck, and when he heard me running out, he came to investigate. I told him about the creature, and he only shrugged like this was just one more thing on this plate. He offered to go get my car for me, and when I asked him if he wasn't afraid of the things down there, he said it was nothing new. Stuff like this happens all the time, he said, and he told me to go wait for him in the front lobby. There's a guy there who I think will want to talk to you. I have a feeling he knows just about what you're talking about. The Mercedes in question came rolling up at that point, and Dr. Long seemed relieved. I finished my notes, but I could feel him staring in much the same way he had described the creatures staring at him. So, have you ever heard of anything like this before? Yeah, it's not the first time. If it happens again, just stay in the elevator until it stops. The hospital is like a strange kind of waiting room all its own. Sometimes you slip into places that you aren't prepared for, and it's best to just wait until reality reasserts itself. I don't think I'll be in the parking structure again. I'll take my chances in staff parking. A few dings on the door is a small price to pay for peace of mind. He thanked me before leaving, and I transcribed his notes into the PDF I was keeping for weird things that happened around here. Eventually, we all slip into that strange other room just beyond the waiting room, and if you're lucky, you get to slip back out again, too. Dr. Long was lucky, but he may not get lucky a second time. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you're thinking you might like to become one of my patrons, follow the link below to my Patreon. And as always, however you support the show, I appreciate it. Till next time, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.